Michael, where?
Michael, I believe something's just occurred.
Yes, Steve. A suicide bombing has just taken place at the Jordanian embassy.
This attack in August 2003 was the first car bombing of the Iraqi insurgency, and Australian journalist Michael Ware was there on the spot filming, something that would become common as the war rolled on. But just a few months earlier, Saddam Hussein was still in power, and Michael Ware was just another journalist.
I was a war correspondent for Time magazine, sent in to cover the conflict from the north. I was in my 30s and still young and dumb enough for war to have its false sense of adventure. I simply couldn't have been happier.
But he's now seeing things other journalists have not, and is releasing a documentary called Only the Dead, drawn largely from hundreds of his own tapes.
This was the first day I ever held a camera. A small, beat-up handycam I've carried with me ever since.
The documentary details his obsession with this man, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the founder of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Islamic State militants earned headlines last year when they started to behead Western journalists. But it was Zarqawi who shocked the world first.
The website claims the murder was the work of alleged Al-Qaeda operative Abu Musab al-Zarqawi.
These were the last moments of American hostage Nicholas Berg's life. Then he was pushed to the ground. The video goes on to show his head being hacked off.
That was just the start of Zarqawi's media rollout. When he wanted to ramp up his presence, he turned to Michael Ware.
This Western journalist views horrifying video sent to him by an Islamic insurgent group in Iraq.
Oh my God, I've not seen this.
This is a very, very sophisticated part of Zarqawi's information campaign, stamping him as the star of the new global jihad.
Zarqawi was drawn to Michael Ware because he was one of the first journalists to make contact with other insurgents.
This homemade tape they gave me was proof I'd made contact. It's probably the first insurgent video of the war. I know these men and feel bad about this tape. Filmed just for me when I insisted on proof they were really fighting.
Contact by contact, he gained their trust.
Soon I wasn't just watching their tapes. They began taking me to secret meetings in the dead of night. That's my breathing, as I'm doing the filming. It was frightening. I'd surrendered myself to these guerrillas, men the Americans were hunting, and I had found, not knowing if they were friends or if they were going to kill me. I guess I knew it was insane, but I couldn't help myself. They insisted on taking me and Yuri on our first attack.
His connections allowed him to gain access to areas that would normally be considered no-go zones.
Zarqawi had seized the equivalent of Midtown Manhattan, right in the middle of Baghdad. Zarqawi's black flags lined the streets, his fighters everywhere. We made one pass down the boulevard, then another.
Continue.
Wait. 90 minutes mujahideen here.
Until we were spotted. One of Zarqawi's men stepping out from the curb, pulling the pin on the grenade, stopping our car.
Ware was then dragged out of his car and kidnapped. They were going to behead him as they had other Western journalists. But his insurgent escort threatened to carry out a turf war with Zarqawi's men, and Ware's life was spared. Many journalists might have gone home at that point, but Zarqawi had become an obsession for the Australian. And now the US was preparing to take Zarqawi on in Fallujah and Ramadi.
If Iraq is to be free and a peaceful society, one part of the country cannot remain under the rule of assassins and terrorists.
We will hunt down the criminals. We will kill them or we will capture them.
U.S. commanders made a somber prediction. The street fighting could be the heaviest since Vietnam.
Michael Ware followed the trail and linked up with the Americans.
It's only 200 yards to home.
Hey, we'll vote! Hey, Will! Go ahead.
Nowhere in Iraq was the war as bloody for the Americans as it was here.
This platoon, since July, we've had 8 WIA
6 KIA. All of my squad leaders and section leaders have been wounded. For a while, our company was fighting at less than 70%. Which gets hard, because when you're in static defense, all you're doing is sitting around waiting to get hit.
Zarqawi was now as wanted a man as Osama bin Laden. The Americans putting a $25 million bounty on his head.
The Americans eventually got their man in 2006. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was killed in an airstrike north of Baghdad. This is how Time magazine broke the news. In that edition, Michael Ware's colleagues wrote that Zarqawi's ideas will haunt the world long after he is gone, and that his death was a much-needed dose of good news from Iraq, but the insurgency is not dead. 9 years later, it still isn't.
Well, ahead of the first screening of Only the Dead, I caught up with Michael Ware just a short time ago. Michael Ware, thanks for being here.
Tony, thank you.
Now, first I should say that the film is as gripping as it is disturbing, but you survived these events quite a long time ago, so why now? Why make this film now? Is it relevant to today?
Well, I think this film could not be more relevant than it is today. I mean, we've seen the rise and rise of the Islamic State, their blitzkrieg across the Middle East. And the events of this film take place within the prehistory of the Islamic State. It's dealing with the man who created it, and we're there at the moment of its inception. So if you want to understand the Islamic State today, then this film is almost essential viewing. But more than that, if you want to truly understand what it takes to fight, to combat the Islamic State, then you need to see this film, because that's the true cost that we're still not talking about.
No, in the past 24 hours, the Iraqi Prime Minister has come out and said, oh, Islamic State is not an Iraqi issue. It didn't start in Iraq, it started in Syria. Well, that's plainly wrong, isn't it?
Oh, that's absolutely wrong. And I would very much challenge the Prime Minister of Iraq on that. I mean, when we of the West removed the regime of Saddam Hussein, we presented a new platform for global jihad right there in the Middle East. And the man who stepped into that breach was the founder of the Islamic State, a man called Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And I was there in Baghdad in August 2003 when he launched his first ever attack. Historically, the first ever attack of what we now know of as the Islamic State. And that was the car bombing of the Jordanian embassy.
In fact, the scenes in the film of that, because you were there, you got there, probably the first camera there, people saying, don't film these bodies, and the bodies are everywhere. It's a horrific scene.
It's hard to imagine now looking back, but an event like that, a suicide bombing, a truck bombing, had never occurred in Baghdad. That was the first one ever. None of us knew what it was. Not the foreigners, not the press corps, not the military, not the Iraqis themselves. So as we see this enormous black plume rising above the houses behind us and drive towards it, none of us could have ever imagined what we were going to find.
Zarqawi would go on to blow up the UN compound. He would begin beheadings on camera. Nicholas Berg famously was beheaded, apparently by Zarqawi himself. That's what we've come to understand. And he hangs, or his presence hangs like a kind of dark cloud over the film. How significant was he? He was, at that stage, he was said to be the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But that is the beginnings, isn't it, of Islamic State?
Very much, very much. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, in effect, single-handedly hijacked the war in Iraq and turned it to his own design, to fulfill his own vision of holy war. Because in the beginning, the insurgency was what was driving the war. This is former Iraqi soldiers and officers and generals fighting against an American occupier on their own land. Well, Zarqawi showed up, and bit by bit, piece by piece, devastating attack by devastating attack, hijacked that entire conflict. And in doing so, he brought about a revolution in holy war. He did what Osama bin Laden would never have dared to have done, nor wanted to have done. In fact, when he started, he was not Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda would not allow him to join, and he did not want to join Al-Qaeda. It was only after a period of time that the two forces, I argue reluctantly, had to come together.
Well, actually, this is one of the most startling historical ironies in a way, because when you think about it, George W. Bush made it one of the reasons for going for invading Iraq in the first place was his claim, based on false intelligence, that Al-Qaeda was already operating in Iraq at a high level with Saddam Hussein, highly exaggerated intelligence. And now they've actually created it. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, of the many tragedies of the war in Iraq, this ranks certainly among the greatest, in that indirectly, inadvertently, we of the West created the very thing that we say we went to Iraq to prevent. There was no Al-Qaeda under Saddam before we went there. There was no Islamic State. There was barely any Islamic militancy because Saddam himself didn't allow it. But by removing that regime, we accidentally created the environment perfect for them to rise up and to flourish.
Let's take one step back, because as a reporter in Iraq with a tiny little video camera, when it all started to go pear-shaped for the Americans after the successful invasion, the occupation goes horribly wrong, and you go out to try and find the insurgents that are blowing up American vehicles, that are doing all these things. How did you do it, first of all, because no one else managed to do that?
Well, what struck me early on during the American occupation is the Americans clearly didn't understand who they were fighting. And why these men were shooting at them in the first place.
How did you find them? Because this is the key thing. I mean, first of all, you're the enemy, or you should be considered the enemy, because you'd been working alongside the Americans. You're actually an Australian. Yes. Did you use that? I mean, did they think you were a neutral or something?
No, that worked against us, because often you would hear the refrain in Iraq and in other parts of the Middle East, Bush, Blair, Howard. We as Australians did not escape the accusation from the Arab street.
So why didn't they consider you to be an enemy? Why did they bring you on board, allow you to film behind the scenes?
They considered my nationality an enemy. But the way I was able to penetrate the insurgency, certainly at first, was piece by piece. It was one personal relationship after another. As we say in the film, I start with one man who I knew and who'd served in the military, and he certainly wasn't an insurgent. But friends of his friends certainly were, or his cousin, or someone he served with in a military unit, you know, under Saddam was.
And then, you know, with your camera at night, you're out with them when they're actually firing mortars at the Americans, when they're planning and doing operations. I mean, how were you conflicted at that point?
Oh, of course I was. I mean, here I am with, you know, our so-called enemy attacking, you know, our Western forces. But like I said, no one had any idea who these guys were. They were being ridiculed as amateurs and criminals, and yet here they were, clearly sophisticated, with well-defined command and control structure, and nationalised. But the thing was, I considered it like an embed. Now, I've been on literally hundreds of embeds with the American forces. Now, when I go on those embeds, I am seeing Iraqis being attacked and dying, and civilians in collateral damage. I had to treat it as the same thing, that I was on an embed with them for a purpose to find a piece of the truth.
Well, it's forever been the role of journalists to try and see both sides of a story. It just becomes quite complicated. Here's what happens. As a trusted journalist, they start bringing you videos of their actions to your hotel and to other places, I imagine. Not only against US troops, but of their street executions, of really serious and horrific violence that they've done. Why do they choose you to do that? And did you feel, at that stage, you were their conduit to Western television, Western media?
what I was trying to find out was who was doing these suicide bombings. What was this sinister force that was behind the insurgents that had a totally different agenda? And that was Zarqawi and his forces, who now we know as the Islamic State. It was them, it was their videos.
Yeah, so through cutouts, they start providing you with their videos.
Don't forget, this was almost not quite a pre-internet age, but it was pre-social media. There was no YouTube, there was no Twitter, there was no Facebook. So when Zarqawi decided for the first time to really declare his arrival on the global stage, he'd been secretly making this video. And when it was ready, as the courier told me, the Command Council sat down all day and argued about what to do with it. Do we give it to Al Jazeera? Do we give it to this one? Do we give it to that one? And they say at the end of the day, it was the Prince of Princes himself who said, give it to the infidel. And it came to me. Now, that was the one that I publicised widely, because that gave us an insight into who was doing this, how they were doing it, and the fact that they were not going away.
I wanted to ask you whether you ever met Zarqawi, but there's a moment in the film, we see it, where you kind of cross the line between, well, you cross the safety line, you know, you're never really safe, but you cross the line, and I think it's in Haifa Street, and here's where Zarqawi's people have actually taken over a main boulevard in the centre of the capital of Iraq. So you go there, tell us what happens.
Well, essentially, as Zarqawi was hijacking the war, one of the first great acts that he did was he captured a central part of Baghdad. It was well within mortar and rocket range of the US Embassy, and this is right under the Americans' noses, and there's nothing anyone could do about it. When this happened, some of the insurgents who'd been ousted in that takeover came to me and told me about it. And I needed proof before I could report this. This was a significant development in the war, right in the heart of the capital.
So you go to secretly film Zarqawi's men having taken over a key boulevard in the capital. What happens?
This key area, as I'm driving in a car with an insurgent guide and my trusted driver, I'm in the back seat filming between the headrests the flags of Zarqawi's organ, the black flags that are now lining this central boulevard. As I'm doing so, I could clearly see scores of Zarqawi's jihadis up and down the street, but I went to pains not to film them. Unfortunately, as we were leaving that area, we were spotted. And with one of the black banners flapping behind him, one of Zarqawi's men steps out from the median strip, pulls the pin on a grenade, cocks his arm, and stops our car. And that's when I was dragged from the vehicle.
Yeah, and that's the point where you actually think, this is it for me. I'm going to end up like Nicholas Bird.
Yes.
Was that a serious threat? Did you think you were going to have you? Did you think they were going to behead you, literally?
They were going to behead me. This was at the height of the period where Zarqawi's men were targeting Westerners, taking them and beheading them. I was a target of opportunity. When I was taken, there was some commotion there on the street, and it was clear that I wasn't going to be spirited away and held hostage. It wasn't too long before I was dragged behind one of the apartment blocks, and there was a hastily slung black banner like we were seeing in all the execution videos. And there, lined up, were the men who were going to cut my head off, indeed a man with a knife. And in fact, they were going to film it with my own camera. But it was at this moment, where there's two of them arguing about how to work my camera, that my insurgent escort finally piped up and stepped in and said that they could not kill me. He said that there will be a turf war between our two groups if you kill this man because he's our guest. And it was only through gritted teeth that Zarqawi's men literally pushed me back, and I became the only Westerner who ever survived Zarqawi's organisation.
So it becomes really too dangerous at this point for you to spend time with the insurgents. You actually go back with the Americans and you embed again with the American Marines and others, and particularly in some of these battles of for key towns in Al-Anbar province, which, as we see now, are all being fought over again. Ramadi among them. Tell us how you actually win a fight in one of these towns, because you could see with all their arms, with all their resources, the Americans seem to find this almost impossible.
Look, I think a lot of people forget that Ramadi was the first ever capital of the Islamic State. And when it was declared that capital, there was a small group of American soldiers and Marines who were posted there and told to hold the line. It was so bad at that time, they were fighting for their lives just to keep one road through the city open. And they were under constant attack. It was very, very clear that they didn't have enough troops. And even if they did, there was no way that they were going to be able to win that fight for that city. There was no way they could kill their way out of that battle.
Now, Michael, I've got to say, I've seen a lot of war footage from that time. I've never seen this footage, and it's amongst some of the most violent, chaotic, dangerous scenes that I've ever seen filmed. First of all, you want to know how you actually survived it, but then you think about the consequences, what it actually means fighting in a city like that, because now you've got the Iraqi army, a Shia army, supposedly going in to fight in exactly the same place where the Americans pretty much failed. I mean, how can they do it?
Well, I don't think that they can. And during the American experience, if there was a Kaysan of the Iraq War, it was Ramadi. And now that the Islamic State has retaken it, the Iraqi security forces, both the official and the unofficial, do not possess the capability, certainly not right now, to retake that city. In the end, the only solution that can possibly lead to a return of that city to any kind of normalcy will be if the local population and the tribes yet again rise up, as they did in 2006 and 2007. But for a whole host of reasons, now, today, that's almost certainly not going to happen. It's not a battle that can be won.
Yeah, you mentioned 2006 and 2007. It's when it finally dawned on people, this was a Sunni area and you had to actually have the support of the Sunni tribes to defeat ISIS or IS, Islamic State, whatever you want to call them. Is there any way you can see now to actually defeat them in these places? Because when you send in Iranian-backed Shia troops to try and do this, isn't that just going to bring all those tribes together?
Well, it's just throwing fuel on the fire. And it's been the actions of successive Iraqi governments, but particularly since the US left that country, that has herded the Sunni population back towards the Islamic State. Many of them feel that they've had no choice. They certainly don't want to be living under a regime or in the kind of society that the Islamic State creates. But they feel that they're better protected that way from their own government.
So how do you feel? I mean, we're watching now these talks in Paris where, you know, our own foreign minister is there and everyone's trying to work out a strategy for defeating Islamic State. There does seem to be one obvious thing you could do, and that is to change completely the way you deal with those tribes, but no one seems capable of doing it.
Those tribes aren't there to be dealt with again, certainly not in the way that they were in 2006 and 2007. It took years of work for the US military to develop the trust and the rapport, because these tribes were the insurgency. And when the Americans, under the Bush administration, finally cut the deal with these tribes, essentially they put 107,000 insurgents on the US government payroll at $300 a month, and the insurgency virtually stopped overnight, and the Islamic State woke up dead. Now the problem is, those tribes are not the tribes they used to be. They're not as powerful as they were back then, they're not as organised as they were back then, and they're more vulnerable, because the Americans are not there to offer them assistance, particularly against their own government. Now,
finally, I'll bring you back to the film for the end of the interview. You know, and in this horrific conflict, you say in the film that you found in yourself a kind of dark side. I mean, there's a kind of, we see an existential fight going on around you, and you find in yourself some darkness as well. And there's a particularly grueling, gruesome scene at the end of the film where it sort of seems to demonstrate that you felt you had crossed a line somehow. Tell us about that.
Well, you know, a soldier once wrote that there's certain dark chambers of the heart that once opened can never be closed again. And when you're living that human experience in war, which is stretched to its extreme, you start to find these places within your own self There was an incident that I witnessed, in fact, an incident that I filmed. And by my silence, I became complicit in what happened around me. All I had to do was clear my throat. All I had to do was say something, and the situation would have changed. But I made a decision in that moment to keep filming and not to do anything. You did what
photojournalists have been doing in war for years, which is to keep viewing it through the lens.
I mean, journalistically, in a way, that was a very clear choice. We're there to observe and to record, and by capturing one particular moment of horror, you hope that you can amplify it and tell a much larger story and perhaps achieve a much larger good. And I'd made that decision journalistically within myself years before. But morally, of course, we're still people. And someone's suffering does not change just because you have your journalist hat on.
You obviously have come to terms with it in some way.
Look, any soldier who's been to war, any civilian who's had to live it, will tell you that there are certain things that you just have to come to terms with to move forward. In so many ways, the experience of going to war is humbling. It brings you a whole new perspective to life. I'll never see the world the same way again. And in so many ways, that's a privilege. That from now on, every day is a gift for me and for so many of my friends. And I wouldn't trade that. But it takes work to get there, as any soldier will tell you. Often, the homecoming is harder than the war itself.
Michael Ware, it's, I think, in the end, a very profound thing that you've been there to witness this and to bring us the film. So we thank you very much for that and for coming in to talk to us.
Tony, thank you very much.